Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 17. American Confusions, 1945 to 1950. The American response to the Soviet refusal of post-war cooperation was confused and tentative. For months after the Truman administration recognized the situation, it was reluctant to make any public announcement of this fact because our military demobilization could not be reversed until it had run its course in 1947, and until a new strategic system and consequent military organization could be reached. For this reason, the first announcement came from Winston Churchill in his speech in Fulton, Missouri, in June 1946. In this, he spoke of the Iron Curtain, which Stalin was lowering between the Soviet bloc and the West. It was also British initiative over Greece and Turkey at the end of the year which led to the Truman Doctrine of March 1947. Truman could not get any constructive help from the leaders of the armed forces in establishing a new strategy. They were much too busy fighting each other in protection of the vested interests surviving from World War II. So he was forced to fall back on other forms of resistance, particularly economic, diplomatic, and ideological. The resulting strategy is known as containment. It lasted from early 1947 to 1953 and was resumed gradually after 1958. Its chief characteristics were economic and financial aid to other nations to eliminate the misery and ignorance which fosters communism, and acceptance of the rights of neutrals and allies, to follow their own policies and to be consulted on our policies without primary reliance on our military force. As early as August 1945, Truman asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, to draw up recommendations for America's post-war security needs. The bitter rivalries among the three services made it impossible for the Joint Chiefs of Staff to agree on a common strategy, and thus they could not ascertain the country's weapons needs. At the time, the Air Force was convinced that the next war would be very brief and would be settled by the Strategic Air Command dropping atom bombs on enemy cities. In its view, the Army and Navy's roles would be restricted to mopping up after Strategic Air Command had defeated the enemy. Accordingly, it wanted 70 air groups of the new 6-engine propelled B-36 bombers, Convair, which flew in prototype in 1946 after 6 years' work, but which would not be available in quantity until 1949. When jet propulsion made them obsolete. The Navy in 1945 was much larger than all other navies of the world combined, a 5-ocean navy to fight a no-ocean opponent, said the Air Force. But its future had been placed in great jeopardy by the atom bomb tests staged at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific in 1946. These tests showed that a fleet would suffer very great damage unless widely dispersed from atomic explosions in the air, while a blast underwater would drench it with almost eradicable radioactivity. Nevertheless, the Navy had to seek a role in the growing rivalry with Russia, and pinned its hopes on its ability to reach the enemy with atom-armed planes flown from the deck of a 65,000-ton supercarrier of astronomical cost. The Army, almost eclipsed by the plans of its more glamorous rivals, wanted universal military training, UMT, leading to highly trained reserve units, in spite of the Air Force's insistence that World War III would be over before ground forces could be mobilized. These disagreements between services made it impossible for the Joint Chiefs of Staff to achieve any agreement on strategy or on weapons needs in answer to Truman's request of 1945. Accordingly, in June 1946, they informed the president that a unified strategy could be reached only after achievement of a unification of the three services into a single organization. For this reason, it was not until April 1950 that the United States obtained a strategic military policy to underlie Truman's policy of containment, which was then 3 years old. The new strategic policy was embodied in NCS 68, which, despite its code identification, did not come from the National Security Council, but was the child of the policy planning staff of the State Department, led by Paul Nitz. The inability of the armed services to provide the country with a defense policy because of inter-service rivalries is a consequence of the fact that military leaders are specialists and technicians concerned with means rather than with goals, and, like all technicians, need guidance or goals set by other persons with larger perspectives. This weakness is more obvious in peacetime than in war, and is more common among Americans than among some others. Americans work together best when the organization's goal is explicitly established. In this they differ from the British, who can work together perfectly well in organizations without any apparent goals, and are indeed suspicious of any desire to establish explicit goals or overriding policy. Americans, when goals are established, as they are in business, in peacetime, by the balance sheet, or as they are in war, by the desire for victory, work together very effectively. But political work in peacetime, with its ambiguous goals, is regulated to rivalry, bickering, and total inability to relate means to goals. As a result, the means themselves tend to become goals. It was the emphasis upon means rather than goals, and the compromises between conflicting means which led to the National Security Act of 1947. This sought to evade the need for clear, hard thinking about goals, and the subordination of means to goals by reorganization of the top levels of governmental operation concerned with security. It set up a system based on secrecy and anonymity, which may, in time, revolutionize the whole American system of government. In this reorganization, there were at least three major parts. 1. Unification of the armed services. 2. Creation of the National Security Council as an advisory board to the President. And 3. Reorganization of the whole system of intelligence and spying through the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the code-breaking National Security Agency, NSA. Basically, rivalry among the American armed services was a rivalry for congressional appropriations, a struggle over slicing the annual budget. In this struggle, each service sought to convince congressmen that its particular weapons provided the best defense for the United States. The Air Force, which in 1946 was still a branch of the Army, touted the claims of the manned bomber. The Navy, only recently disillusioned with its old love, the battleship, had now shifted its affection to the aircraft carrier. The Army had to stick with a humble foot soldier, but almost concealed him from view with its insistence on trucks, tanks, and cannon. As a matter of fact, the manned bomber, the aircraft carrier, and the tank were all obsolescent in 1946, but their supporters were unwilling to concede this, since such a concession would, they thought, shift appropriations to the other services. The manned bomber was threatened by rockets with homing devices, which would bring such rockets, at speeds higher than manned bombers could ever reach, in for the kill by seeking out the plane's engine exhaust, heat, or by use of radar and electronic eye devices. The aircraft carrier was threatened by atomic bombs, since it was too vulnerable to these to justify its cost of over $100 million. The tank was threatened by shaped charges, and, in general, the whole tactical outlook of ground forces, with their traditional emphasis on mass and concentration, was challenged by nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, which put great value on dispersal. In these struggles between the services, the clashes are particularly bitter, in a period of demobilization, and this bitterness is accentuated by the fact that each service has alliances with the industrial complexes which supply their equipment. These complexes not only supply funds, such as advertising, for each service to carry its message to the Congress and the people, but also exert every influence to retain equipment and tactics in obsolescent modes and types. But also exert every influence to retain equipment and tactics in obsolescent modes and types, but newer models, by dangling before the high officers who can influence contracts, offers of future well-paying consultant positions with the industrial firms concerned. Most high officers of the American Armed Forces in the war and post-war period retired before the fixed age of 62, often on a disability basis, which exempted retirement pay from income taxes, and then took consultant jobs with industrial firms whose chief business was in war contracts. Thus, 4-star General Brehon B. Somerville, Chief of Army Service Forces in World War II, retired on a disability salary of $16,000 a year at the age of 54 to join a number of industrial firms, including Koppers, which paid him $125,000 a year. 3-star General L.H. Campbell, Chief of Ordnance in World War II, retired on disability at $9,000 a year at age 59 and became an executive at $50,000 a year of firms from whom he had previously purchased $3 billion in armaments. 4-star General Clay retired at 52 on $16,000 a year, but signed up at once with General Motors and Continental Can at over $100,000 a year. 3-star Air Force General Ira C. Ecker left the service at age 50 with $9,000 a year and joined Hughes Tool Company at $50,000. Another 3-star Air Force General Harold C. George went with Ecker to Hughes at $40,000. General Joseph T. McNarney, in 1952, took his 4 stars and $16,000 a year to join Consolidated Vultee at $100,000. These are but a few of more than 100 general officers whose post-retirement alliances with industrial firms encouraged their successors still on active service to remain on friendly terms with such appreciative business corporations. These connections undoubtedly inhibit officers of the armed services in their efforts to obtain fresh ideas, fresh tactics, and fresh equipment for America's defense. In this struggle, there occurs rivalry between the services to secure larger shares of existing budgets. But there also occurs cooperation to increase the total joint budget. The best way to do the latter is by war scares, which undoubtedly increase appropriations for all services. The spectacular increase in the joint defense budget of the United States from about $14 billion in the late 1940s to about $60 billion in the early 1960s is partly caused by a real Soviet threat to the United States, but it is also partly caused by a scare engendered by the armed services. If the Soviet Union had been deterred from aggression by the expenditures, the money was well spent. But since the Soviet Union never has had any intention of engaging the United States in open war, it is legitimate to believe that many of the billions spent could have been used to fight the Soviet Union in more remunerative ways than by the purchase of manned bombers, aircraft carriers, or tanks. The struggles between the services in the United States after 1945 have been vigorous and often unscrupulous. They have involved putting pressure on administrators in the executive branch from the president down, and especially on the high civilian heads in the Pentagon, of misleading congressmen and of propagandizing the public. The Air Force, for a variety of reasons, was the most successful of the three services in this propaganda war. After all, flyers had plenty of experience, since they had been propagandizing the world since about 1908. 5 years after the first plane flew, without benefit of publicity in 1903. The Air Force was interested only in strategic bombing and had little interest in tactical work under command of ground forces, which the flyers insisted hampered their special genius. To get free of the Army and become a separate service, co-equal with the Navy and Army, the Army Air Forces in 1946 put their full pressure behind legislation to unify the armed services. Unify here really meant change two into three. This was done by reducing the 2 cabinet posts for War and Navy to a single post for Defense, with 3 equal secretaries for Army, Navy, and Air outside the cabinet. The unity, presumably, was to be obtained from the Secretary of Defense's control over the 3 service secretaries. But this was impossible since they were named by the President, not by the Secretary of Defense, and they had little influence over their services, each of which looked to its chief commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The fact that the Joint Chiefs had operational command of their departments meant that they had to defend the diverse interests of these and could contribute little to unity or to any general ideas, even strategic ones. While if they had been separated from their actual commands in order to be free to reach a general consensus on strategic ideas, they would have retained no control over their services. The only real lines of authority in the whole system were those in the hands of the President himself, and those lines of command going downward from the Joint Chiefs of their own services. There were only very weak lines between the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs, or to his service secretaries, or between the latter and the services for which they were responsible. As a result, very little unification was achieved, even after amendments to the Act, and in 1949 the inter-service rivalries reached their most intense peak. By the end of that year, UMT, the supercarrier, and the 70 Group Air Force were all dead, killed off by inter-service rivalries, in spite of the fact that all public opinion polls showed strong support for all of them. James Forrestal, who had been Secretary to the Navy since 1944, and who, on behalf of the Navy, had emasculated the Unification Bill, was made first Secretary of Defense, and was called upon to administer it in 1947. Within a year, he had reversed his opinions and was demanding amendments to strengthen the Act, especially the powers of his own post. His mind collapsed under the strain, and he resigned in 1949, committing suicide shortly afterward. Although public opinion polls showed that 2/3 of Americans approved UMT and only a quarter or less opposed it, the Air Force in 1948 was able to persuade the Congress that there was a necessary choice between UMT and the 70 Group Air Force. Accordingly, the Air Force budget was raised $822 million, and UMT was buried in committee. Forrestal was replaced as Secretary of Defense by Louis Johnson, one-time national commander of the American Legion, who favored the Air Force, as Forrestal had favored the Navy, in these intramural battles. Although the supercarrier had been authorized and appropriated for, and although construction had begun under Forrestal, Johnson used a vote of 2-1 in the Joint Chiefs of Staff against it, Admiral Louis Dinfield in the minority, as excuse for canceling the contract. The subsequent admiral's revolt took the form of anonymous letters to Congress, charging corruption on the B-36 contract, as well as public charges, which were quite correct, that the plane was already obsolete. The whole scandal received a full-scale congressional investigation, the B-36 affair, as a result of which the B-36 was discredited. Admiral Dinfield was removed from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Johnson, having alienated everyone by his efforts to save money, was replaced by General Marshall, 1950. The Unification Act had excluded retired officers from the post of Secretary of Defense, but this clause was made unapplicable to General Marshall so that he could succeed Johnson in 1950. Thus, the supporters of each of the three services held the position successively in less than a 2-year period. Marshall said that he took the job to get UMT, but the act, as passed in 1951, was in a form which allowed the administration to prevent its execution, and it never went into effect. In its place, troops were raised for the services, chiefly the Army, by successive extensions of the wholly unsatisfactory Selective Service Acts. The inter-service battles of 1945 to 1950 were largely a victory for the Air Force, which got rid of the supercarrier and UMT, and thus obtained the biggest bite for the budget. Much of this bite went to Strategic Air Command, which had been created in March 1946, and was taken over from General George Kinney by General Curtis E. LeMay in October 1948. At the time, Strategic Air Command was really Strategic Air Defense, starting in 1946, with only a single group able to deliver the atom bomb. For most of this period, it struggled along with the 300-mile-per-hour B-29. It lacked planes, bases, equipment, and trained men. Above all, it still operated on the old premise that the outbreak of war would be preceded by negotiations and mobilization. LeMay changed all that. He was not a desk soldier, nor was he a paper pusher. Ruthless, efficient, and single-minded, he flitted about from base to base in a self-piloted plane, a big cigar clamped at a belligerent angle in his set jaw. He gave Strategic Air Command a single purpose, or mission. Isolated it from everything else in the defense chaos by moving its headquarters from Washington to Nebraska, and demanded immediate and efficient war readiness. With sufficient funds, LeMay would have kept a third of Strategic Air Command in the air at all times, ready to go, another third at war readiness for quick takeoff, and the final third on call within a few hours. Until 1952, when he began to get the new 8-engine Intercontinental B-52s, he bridged the gap with modified B-36s and medium-range 6-jet B-47s. With the support of Air Secretary Thomas K. Finleder, he established bases within range of the Soviet Union in Europe, Greenland, North Africa, and Okinawa. By 1955, he had a force of remarkable efficiency and high morale, a success resulting from 3 factors which provide a lesson for all organizational success: a clear-cut mission, leadership, and continuity. The last quality was achieved by retaining LeMay in command of the Strategic Air Command for 8 years, in violation of the established armed services practice of 3 to 4 year periods of rotation of duty. In all this turmoil of controversy in 1947 to 1950, the Army had not been idle. Its struggles for promotions, pay increases, prerequisites, and assignments were ensured success to some extent, by creating a new kind of army. An army top-heavy with officers and paper pushers who worked from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., 5 days a week, and had very little fighting effectiveness. This was done by setting up a structure of officers and auxiliary activities which absorbed almost the total budget of the department in non-combat lines and filled the combat units. Its struggles for promotions, pay increases, perquisites, and assignments were ensured success to some extent by creating a new kind of army. An army top-heavy with officers and paper pushers who worked from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., 5 days a week, and had very little fighting effectiveness. This was done by setting up a structure of officers and auxiliary activities, which absorbed almost the total budget of the department in non-combat lines, and filled the combat units with a small number of short-term draftees of very little combat value. In January 1952, for example, the Department of Defense had 5 million employees, of which 3.7 million were in uniform and 1.3 million were civilians. Those in uniform used up $37 billion for pay, food, housing, and clothing. That is $10,000 per head, in a total defense budget of $46 billion. The 1.3 million civilians cost $5.2 billion, or $4,000 a year each, leaving only $3 billion in the total defense budget for equipment, research, and other costs which contribute directly to defense. The Army's share of the 3.7 million uniformed personnel was 2 million, but that provided only 12 divisions, at most 150,000 men, for combat. In spite of these enormous expenditures, the puny combat effectiveness of the standing army was shown in the Korean War, when 9/10 of the officers in combat were reserves, who had to be called from their peacetime activities to fight. The Army solution to the disappointments of Korea was more of the same. In June 1951, the Selective Service Act of 1948 was amended to drop the draft age from 19 to 18 and raise the authorized limit on the men in active service from over 2 million to 5 million. That is, the qualitative deficiencies of Korea were to be solved by quantitative increases of the same inadequate quality, a step which might not improve America's defense position, but could justify increasingly rapid promotion for officers. The last few months of 1949 include the major turning points in the whole period 1947 to 1963. 3 events which mark this were the well-publicized B-36 crisis, the loss of China, and the secret H-bomb crisis which followed the explosion of the Soviet Union's first atom bomb in August. Another significant event of the period was the organization of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, following the Treaty of April 4th, 1949, signed in Washington. This mutual defense pact, to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of the peoples founded on the principle of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, had as signers the United States, Canada, and 10 West European countries, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, the United Kingdom, Portugal, and Italy. In February 1952, Greece and Turkey joined the pact, and in May 1955, the West German Federal Republic became a member. The agreement was largely anchored on Germany. It flowed out of the threat provided by the Berlin blockade and directly implied the merging of West Germany into the Western camp. As the chief step in this process, the 3 western zones of Germany were merged into one, and in September 1949, the military rule of Germany was replaced by the Adenauer regime. Throughout this period, fear of communism was growing within the United States. The real threat, if any, behind this fear is still uncertain. The Soviet and communist hatred of the American way of life is well established, and the existence of the American Communist Party as a willing tool of an international communist conspiracy directed from Moscow is also beyond dispute. Such communists were undoubtedly engaged in subversion and espionage, and were assisted in these efforts by fellow travelers and other sympathizers. Moreover, some communists and fellow travelers were undoubtedly present in government and, to a greater degree, in some other areas, notably certain labor unions, higher education, and especially in the more creative end of the entertainment field, such as the theater, writing, and Hollywood scenario production. On the other hand, the number of communists in the United States, according to the FBI, was only about 75,000 in 1945, and fell steadily to 50,000 in 1950, and to 3,000 in 1960. It is still impossible to make any real assessment of the influence of communists, either in government or out of it. In the period of 1949 to 1950, with which we are now concerned, this is equally true of the earlier years, going back to 1933, with which most of the charges and countercharges made in 1949 were concerned. The chief reason for this is that secrecy, which still prevails, was used by both sides to portray, by selective publicity, a false picture. Falsehood, manipulation, selection, and distortion of evidence were prevalent on both sides, and were used especially by the anti-communists, not because they were less addicted to the truth than communists, but because they, on the offensive, were the ones who were raising the issues and exposing the evidence. Apparently, these anti-communists, including the press, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, felt that a good cause justified shoddy or misleading methods. The Communist Party of the United States, CPUS, like others throughout the world, was always, from its founding in 1919, a tightly disciplined body of conspirators whose primary allegiance was to the Soviet Union and whose secondary aim, after the preservation of the Soviet Union itself, was to establish a similar regime in the United States. Tactics varied from year to year, and the party line shifted with changing political and world conditions, without, however, ever abandoning these two goals. In 1935, with the threat of fascism spreading through the world, the Communist International, Comintern, adopted a popular front tactic, which was, essentially, a temporary alliance of all non-fascist groups to oppose Nazi aggression and to support the Soviet Union against German attack. In this period, the Communist Party of the United States was a relatively open group, with openly available headquarters and telephone numbers, and with a good deal of cooperation and free exchange through a broad spectrum of political and social activities, and cooperation from the political center to the extreme political left. There was, at that time, widespread disillusionment with the existing structure of society because of enormous unemployment, pervasive poverty, and bourgeois paralysis in the face of economic stagnation and fascist aggression. Communist insistence that something be done about these things won widespread sympathy, even in circles which were totally non-communist. The communists themselves took full advantage of this atmosphere by establishing communist front and fellow traveler organizations of all kinds, and the distinction between party members and fellow travelers became very free, confused, and blurred. The communist command system, however, remained fully aware of who were devoted to their permanent goals and who were not, and retained general control, under cover, of all organizations they regarded as important. This ambiguous situation of left-wing fellowship began to break down in 1938 to 1940, as the complete dominance of Soviet national selfishness within communist parties everywhere became evident, at first in Spain, later in the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939, and in the Soviet-Finnish War the following winter. For the American Communist Party, the chief turning point here was the enactment of the Foreign Agents Registration Act in 1940. The United States Communist Party broke its affiliation with the Comintern and instead established a secret link between the Comintern and the United States Party, chiefly through Gerhard Eisler, who was finally deported in 1949 and became an official of the East German Communist regime. In 1943, the Comintern itself was officially dissolved by the Soviet government, although secretly it continued to exist. As part of this same process, in a sort of wartime common front, the United States Party itself was dissolved in 1944 and reappeared at once as the Communist Political Association. Earl Browder, who personified the Popular Front tactic of the 1930s, continued as the head of the political association and the Common Front tactic until July 1945, when he was removed as a traitor to the Marxist-Leninist ideology and replaced by William Z. Foster. At the same time, the Communist Party of the United States was reestablished to pursue a more aggressive and narrower policy.